The Business of Biotech is produced by Life Science Connect and its community of learning, solving, and sourcing resources for biopharma decision makers. If you're working on biologics process development and manufacturing challenges, you need to swing by bioprocessonline.com. If you're trying to stay ahead of the cell or gene therapy curve, visit cellandgene.com. When it's time to map out your clinical course, let clinicalleader.com help. And if optimizing outsourcing decisions is what you're after, check out outsourcepharma.com. We're Life Science Connect, and we're here to help. If there's a noteworthy trend in our talks with the leaders of new and emerging biotechs over the past 12 to 18 months, it's a steep increase in the application of, or at the very least, interest in machine learning, AI, and computational biology tools in general. Even those who are using some ultra-light application of new computational technology are eager to talk about it. It's as clearly become as en-vogue as tacking bio onto your moniker was a few years ago, even among companies who aren't actually developing biologics. So when it comes to the computational biology buzz, what's real? What's hype? What's yielding benefit? And what's merely vaporware? I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. And on today's episode, we're coloring outside of the lines a little bit by welcoming a guy who's not developing biologics, but is developing computational tools for a variety of antibody design applications. But Andrew Satz is even more than that. Over the course of conversations with him, I've concluded that his 360-degree view of the intersection of life sciences and computational technology is arguably unparalleled and inarguably pragmatic. He brings a ton of value to offer the computational curious among us, and he's flat out a fantastic guy. So I invited him on the show. Andrew, it's great to see you, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much, man. Thanks for that great introduction.
Well, we got to wind it up somehow. And I mean every word of it. Absolutely true. I've spent, I don't know, we've had two or three conversations now where, I'm like, hey, let's jump on the phone for 15 minutes. And 45 minutes later, we're waxing philosophic about something really cool. So I welcome that. I love it. And I'm so thrilled that you're able to join us today. And I, you got to pick a starting point, right? So I'm thinking about what's the starting point with Andrew? And I want the starting point to be some of the colorful backstory, leading up to your professional vocations. Like, you're one of the smartest people, I think, that I have conversations with on a somewhat regular basis. But you were doing smart things coming out of high school, but you put college off for quite some time. Like, you didn't even start studying this stuff for quite some time. So I'm going to ask you to rewind a bit and sort of give us the run up. Let's talk through the run up that led to, what landed you in the position that you're in today.
Yeah. So I've been building or using technology for as long as I can remember, since I was a kid, for all sorts of like business problems or non-business problems. I started my first business when I was 11. Yeah. I didn't go to, as you mentioned, I didn't go to college out of high school because my mother got really sick when I was a kid. So I actually went to work to take care of her. But I've been developing technology for a wide variety of problems throughout my entire life, across industries. And so most notably and most recently relevant to what I'm doing today, what we're doing today, is that helped build some technology for an early stage biotech that was developing peptide-based drugs. Mm-hmm. I helped them bring 3 peptide-based drugs from discovery to IND. And seeing the process of turning a molecule into something that you can inject into humans and all the failure that comes about, thought that we could model some of this process, some of these processes. Actually how our company Evolve was born. But I was an early user of the internet. Early enough. Yeah.
What did you before you even went to college, you had started and sold a business, hadn't you?
Yeah, I started a business in my early 20s. We were selling, I sold insurance online. So I had, at the time, it was like the turn of millennia. So it wasn't like Geico and Progressive selling insurance online today.
Yeah.
But selling commercial insurance online. I think we did $3 million in revenue in my first year of the business, which is kind of like, it was pretty big considering I was 22 at the time. And I actually had, I think of the 100 or so clients, I had met 5 of them in person, which, I don't know, at the time, insurance was very sort of like a heavy touch industry. So, and then I sold that company a couple of years later because I was like, I didn't want to continue selling something that nobody wants to use, because who wants to use their insurance, right? Something bad happened if you had to use your insurance. So I sold it. Yeah.
So at what point did you decide you were going to go to school? What'd you study? And then how did that kind of transition into this interest in the intersection of healthcare and technology?
So I was in my 30s before I started on a bachelor's degree.
Yeah.
I'd done after selling my company, I had a successful career in music, and toured like North and South America. And then I decided that I was like, okay, I've done this for enough time that I've got.
Were you on stage? Were you on stage, or was your capacity technical?
No, I was a DJ. I was a very successful DJ. My mission in life is to bring happiness and freedom to others.
Was your stage name DJ Jazzy Satz?
No.
Oh, I thought that was pretty good.
No, that would have been that. I didn't play hip hop. I played electronic music. But going back to the idea that like my mission in life is to bring healing and freedom to others. And so like if you've danced before, you're not thinking about your problems when you're dancing. And so that was kind of like the rationale. That was my rationale. My goal was just to make people happy. And I did that with music. I also did other things. Like I never do one thing at a time. So I was, also working in the insurance industry, doing consulting, and less cool, less beat up version, less rich beat up version of Batman, where I was doing one thing by day and one thing by night.
Yeah.
And so I retired from that to go to school because I had done it successfully. I have a personal philosophy, like, people often say you only live once. I think you only die once, and you can live as many lives as you like. So, try it. I'm always trying to spend about 5 to 10 years doing something, and then I'll do the next thing to be like, what's that next experience?
Yeah.
So I retired from DJing to go study. I got into Columbia University, finished my undergrad at Columbia in philosophy and economics, basically behavioral economics, because I was really interested in sort of the theory of mind and how do people make decisions, and how do you model that, with the goal of studying data science, which is basically the foundation for artificial intelligence. I have background in statistics. I've been looking at the problems of like the application of AI, really researching the applications of AI for much of the time while I was in the insurance industry and while I was in the music industry. And I saw how it was affecting these, like, you couldn't get more different, right, than these two industries, insurance and music, right? And so I saw how it was affecting both of these industries. I was like, I have to learn more about this. And so I just really was thinking about the applications. So how do you apply it to problems?
Yeah.
And so from 2006 to 2012, I was very much focused on, the idea of people don't buy a drill, they buy a hole. So I was learning how the holes you can make with AI, where AI is the drill. And then I realized I needed to learn how the drill works. That was part of the impetus for going to school, to get my degree, get my bachelor's, and went on to get a master's degree in data science. And then at the end of that process, here I was graduating from a good university in New York City, and didn't have any shortage of offers to work in like tech or finance. But if you look at most of the data science and the tech, what are they doing? They're selling you more clicks. It's really, like, Google still makes nearly 90% of its money off of AdWords.
Yeah.
And finance just didn't appeal to me to go work in finance. Less than 5% of all data scientists at the time were in the entire healthcare ecosystem. And that accounts for 20% of GDP.
Yeah.
And so the question was, how do we apply these types of technologies to solve problems in healthcare and medicine? I had experienced, the healthcare system my mother had multiple sclerosis since I was a kid. And so observing how that affects, and because a lot of it affected from the neck up, and the healthcare system's help. So I was a consumer of the non-valuable outcomes of healthcare.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then in insurance, I was on the other side of it, where I was like helping people leverage the system. And then when we started a company, my co-founder and I started a company right out of grad school doing AI for healthcare consulting. And we did work for accountable care organizations. We did in payers, providers. We got hired by a hospice to predict when patients would die, which is interesting. And then we got hired by a biotech to teach machines to read PET scans. And that's actually ended up working with them on things not specifically AI related. And that was what led to the birth of the company we have today.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's the story I was looking for. This fascinating, like this fascinating story that took you all over the place and put you here.
So it doesn't make any sense why I'm.
What? But the more time I spend with you, the more perfect sense it makes. I mean, there was obviously that inspiration with your mom's experience, and also, I mean, how much different is it being a DJ and just wanting to make people happy from working in a space that's looking to cure and change lives and make people happy, right? I mean, maybe deep down the motive is the same.
Yeah, the motivation is the same, bringing healing and freedom to others. I think the only difference is like when I was playing music, the response was instantaneous.
Immediate, yeah.
Hey, you've got to wait 15 years to see the response, and it only works at, right? Like, and then, you have all the, in the music industry, you also have lots of bad side effects, right? People go to the bars, they're not just there to dance, they're also there to, drink and celebrate life, some of which is not the best ways and some of them in good ways. And so you can kind of think of that as like, the side effects of medication, or right. Like
yeah. There are parallels there for sure. So now you're in this position where you've got a pretty, like I said, a 360-degree view. I mean, you've got a very unique perspective. You've got this very unique perspective, from which you see a lot going on. And I think you're in a pretty good position to be able to sort of assess what you see happening in terms of adoption and acceptance and perhaps appetite for some of these tools in biopharma. So what do you see?
So it really depends on what stage you're talking about, right? Discovery, development, clinic, monitoring, sales and marketing.
Yeah, let's talk. Let's talk discovery and clinic. Let's keep it early stage.
So on the discovery side, right, you have the two major medicines that really capture the significant portion of the sales, right? So you have small molecules and biologics. And within biologics, like our focus at Evolve is really around antibodies. So the real heavy application of AI first started in small molecules, right? Why? Because they're small, right? You have 25 to 50 atoms. And if you think about this from a mathematical perspective, right? Each atom adds an exponential complexity to the possibility of the next atom, right? You have one atom, and then where does the next atom sit relative to the first one, right? And you have this sort of 360 perspective of where it could sit, and then you add the next one, and that adds another layer of complexity. So what happened is that you could actually use image-based analyses for these types of things, because in 25 to 50 atoms, you're getting to some level of complexity, mathematical complexity, which turns into computational complexity that was tractable, especially what a lot of the advancements that were happening in deep learning at the time, right? Where you're having this pixel-based analysis and you can then translate into a voxel-based analysis. A voxel is just a pixel in 3 dimensions, right? So how do you translate that? And you saw a lot of this actually impact in things like when people were doing radio, AI for radio, something like CT or X-ray or PET scans or things like that, because a lot of those are voxel based. When you move to biologics, you're talking about things with 25 to 40,000 atoms. So you can't really solve the problem in the same way because there's no computer on the planet that can do that, solve those problems. So you have to take different approaches. And if you look at what happened with AlphaFold, which is really doing protein structure prediction, they combined evolution, which is, that's part of the reason our company name is Evolve. They combined evolution with some structure-guided approaches so that they could reduce the size of the problem, right? Evolution reduces the size of the problem. It's a way to say, like, you can constrain the problem set. So it's not this infinitely large number or close to infinitely large number from a computational perspective, you can say, okay, it's constrained by what's observable in nature. And so that was really how you saw the sort of bifurcation of this structure-based view in small molecules, which you can apply, moving to more of a evolutionary or which still contains structural views. And now you're starting to see sort of large language models being applied to that, and diffusion models, which are other types of algorithms that can be applied to these problems. And so that's really on the design side of them. And then and that's just designing the molecule. How do you solve the problem of, that's like 1/3 of the equation, right? You have the molecule itself, you have its target, its antigen, and then you have the level at which that interacts with the target. So then you have a sort of like a 3-part problem, and that becomes very, very complex and to predict. So the idea is, like, how do you reduce that search space so you're not searching through billions or trillions of either molecules or in our case, antibodies. So that's on the sort of some of the fundamental problems of just finding in our case, an antibody that binds, right, or a molecule that binds to your target. And now you have to turn that into a drug, right? There's somebody on your podcast who said, small molecules, hard to find a hit, easy to manufacture. Antibodies, easy to find a hit, hard to manufacture. And so you have this other issue of developability.
Yeah.
How do you take that hit and turn it into a lead that can then be moved into things like CMC, or you can do cell line development? How do you, line that information up with the actual sequence itself? And then another interesting thing that really to think about the clinic side is, oftentimes you're not deciding that clinical approach till much later in the process, right? Once discovery is done, and now you have a lead candidate, you're starting to do your IND enabling work, you're starting to design those clinical trials. What we're beginning to see that in the early parts of, and there are some really great companies doing some of this work, in silico medicine's doing some of this work, right? Like where they're starting to pick the patient cohorts as they're designing the molecule, which gets us a little bit closer to precision and a little bit closer to personalized medicine, right? Because today we live in a fantasy world. So, and then you have things like clinical trial design. You have the adaptive clinical trials, which are Bayesian clinical trials, or rather than the traditional frequentist clinical trials. And those are very hard to design, where you're going to run a lot of simulations, and then you need compute to do that. Can you do patient stratification within clinical trial design? Can you use, and oftentimes it's not even just AI, because AI is a buzzword, like patient identification. Could you use things like social network information to start to identify patients that you wouldn't otherwise be able to identify from, electronic health records because they're not accurate?
Now you're getting futurist on us.
Yeah. Well, I can take it. You can look at things like there were a few years ago, some of the first models to predict if someone has Alzheimer's were based upon vocal behavior, which were trained on speeches from Ronald Reagan. Yeah. So that's, because you could actually see his, the neurodegeneration on him, or you could hear it. And could you use some of that information that you can pick up from, social media to say, how people are writing differently, or maybe how they're speaking differently. And that information is like everywhere, right? Everybody's making a YouTube video or recording a podcast. So could you start to predict that kind of stuff?
Sure. Yeah. I want to back up quickly though, to that sort of application, discovery and maybe, early clinical application level, and just get your perspective on what you see happening, like in terms of I guess companies' adoption of it. Like, I mean, do you see a wholehearted embrace of these technologies? Do you see still some resistance? I guess just what is what's your take on that?
I would say
the acceptance level.
Yeah, I would say scientists are probably the second most skeptical group on the planet, maybe after doctors and parents of teenage children.
Yeah.
And so, and it's healthy, right? That skepticism is healthy. I think where the issue that comes about, especially as a technologist and speaking to other technologists about this, is that scientists are not going to believe the computational model's predictions.
Yeah.
The rubber hits the road when it's in vitro, in vivo, in clinic, in market.
Yeah.
Right. And so that skepticism needs to be met with a degree of deference to the scientists themselves to understand that, 99% of the experiments that they've run in their past have failed. Right. That's the process of science.
Yeah.
And so we tend to, in technology, overhype the value of what's been created. I'm as guilty of that as anyone, and I've learned over time as I engage with more and more scientists to continue to be skeptical about what we're observing from our own algorithms.
Yeah.
But I think that the way to overcome that is to show some empirical data, right? Even if it's just giving you a small signal. Because that little bit of change, if you can go from 99% of your experiments failing to 98% of your experiments failing, like that's a big jump.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about it in terms of like the clinical side of things, like 90% of drugs fail. If you change that like 1%, think about the arbitrage value, right? The change in the costs, like what's the new numbers are coming out right now? It's now $6 billion to develop a drug. Last year was $2 billion to develop a drug. Well, take 1% of that.
Yeah.
You see this sort of market difference, and that could have a lot of impact on the market as a whole.
Yeah. Are you? Are you seeing progress in terms of the ability of the computational champions to? And I say I'm using computational. Is that correct? Am I using computational sort of as the general catch-all term?
I prefer that to AI. I prefer that over AI.
Yeah. The next question, I'm gonna finish out this question, then we'll get into a couple of sort of definitions, like level set definitions. But are you seeing the efforts of the computational champion to present that empirical evidence and illustrate the case happening? Is that happening? Like, are we seeing progress in terms of that?
We are seeing progress where we are seeing the sort of the computational link to the lab results. But like, think how cheap it is to run an algorithm,
right? Versus
how expensive it is and time consuming it is to run a lab experiment, right? It's at least an order of magnitude difference. And like, we can run our models in a couple of weeks. But the experiment can take, 4 months. So our predictions are very fast, but the results from the lab take time. And that sort of difference in philosophy and mindset, this sense of urgency, like you can't rush science. You can't make it go any faster. Just biology is going to move at biology speed. Over time, I think we'll start to see some changes, but it's not going to be like a 0 to 1 change. It's going to be like a, 10 to 11 change, right? So I think that that's part of the challenge. And so and everyone's goal is to publish. You can publish a paper on your AI results or your machine learning results or your deep learning results or your transformer results very quickly, while you need more time to get to the lab. And the two groups are speaking very different languages.
We know that early stage biopharmas need support. Producing and scaling a biologic molecule is not easy. Companies with new or evolving programs need assistance every step of the way. Join us each week as we discuss all things emerging biotech, including regulatory, financing, and more. The pod is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva, a global provider of technologies and services that advance and accelerate the development, manufacture, and delivery of therapeutics, from idea to injection. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. You just rattled off. I said the next question we'd do a level set on some definitions. You just rattled off a whole bunch of acronyms in the space. So let's take them one by one and just give us a quick fundamental definition and differentiation, right? Because I think that a lot of people kind of get muddled there. Differentiation, like AL or AI, ML, computation, all kind of falls into the same lump.
Yeah, I mean, like computation is kind of like a calculator's doing computation, right? Like if you're adding two numbers, you're doing computation. It's a general framework for like how you use computers, right? And computers is zeros and ones. How do you turn two numbers into one number, right? Sort of like regression models and things like that. One of the AI is more of like a catch-all buzzword. And I really think that there are multiple kinds of AI. I wrote about this in an article in Life Science Leader about the sort of the 5 kinds of AI.
Yep. I remember what issue that was in.
Oh, it was a couple of years ago. I wrote that. Okay.
Still relevant though. Still
relevant? Absolutely. So let me see if I can find it.
Oh, you don't need to look it up. That's fine. You go to lifescienceleader.com. You'll find it.
Yeah. So from my view, there's 5 different kinds of AI, and I'll give you a basic example. Like there's sort of there's automated intelligence, right, and analytical intelligence. So automated intelligence would be a computer or machine doing something physical that you would otherwise do, right? And often people think about this in the terms of robotics, but if you get like a computer to do something that would take you a lot of time to do, it's also in that process, right? Like where you're reducing your physical labor. ChatGPT is a good example of this, right? So you can write an entire paper. It can do that whole first version of it for you.
Yeah.
So now analytical intelligence is where the computer is actually doing math for you, right? These are things that you could do in your head or on paper if you wanted to. So a calculator would be an example of like an analytical intelligence. And there are 3 other kinds of intelligence that I talk about, like accelerated intelligence, where you're predicting the future, or augmented intelligence. We're kind of fusing all the different other types of intelligence into one space. I think the word artificial intelligence has really lost its meaning because it's being used by all different types of people. Like, my mother is asked me, or my dad asked me about artificial intelligence, and a 6-year-old, and they're probably talking about 2 different, and me, we're all talking about 3 different things.
Right.
I think one thing to point out is sort of like the difference between machine learning and deep learning.
Yeah.
That's a key thing for people to understand. So I'm going to use an example to give a key feature. Let's say you wanted to train a computer to recognize if there's a cat in a picture. So what could you do? You could take the idea of saying, okay, well, I can pick out things that are features of cats. Pointy ears, fluffy tails,
whiskers,
upside down triangle nose, right? Like, and those become features. So they say, like, if an image contains these features in some percentage or probability, then I can predict that image contains a cat, right? By setting some set of features. So oftentimes what we're doing, happening in science, right? You're picking the experiments that you're going to run. That is a feature of that particular whatever you're testing it on, right? And these are oftentimes human designed features or human chosen features. So this is basically how machine learning works. You pick a bunch of features, you have a bunch of a target variable, in this case, a picture of a cat, and then you just give it a new picture of a cat. Given a new picture, can I predict whether it's a cat? There's a completely different way of doing this, but has a similar process. You can just label images that contain cats, right? And a 6-year-old could do that. Is there a cat in the picture? Yes or no? And then you feed the computer the pictures of the cats. And then the computer, using an analytical method, I'm not going to get into how it does it, but I'm happy to explain if you're curious, will then actually define the features. And the way that it does this is it will start by taking little pieces of the picture, 4x4 square of pixels, and go along the picture and say, okay, first it comes up with, an edge, right? And then it comes up with a curve. And then those curves come together and make a shape. And then those shapes together make, a whisker, right? Or whatever. And now the computer is able to say, given a new picture, is it have a cat? Now you need a lot of images. You need 1 million They needed 1 million images to train the first deep learning models to do just this. This is what some of the first deep learning models would do. But in this case, the computer's defining what the features are.
Yeah.
This becomes problematic though. Like if you're trying to like predict pictures for, let's say, for example, CT scans, right? And label CT scans, whether they have, a tumor in them or not. Well, a 6-year-old cannot do that. You need a lot of training, a lot of education to do that. And so this comes into the sort of like the big data problem of applying it to biology or to medicine, right? The lack of data, as opposed to the internet where there's, just mass. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, and that data input, that's a nice segue into some questions around data inputs, because I've had, as I said, from the outset of the conversation, I've had a lot of conversations with companies who are applying machine learning in some capacity, specifically in drug discovery to date, and each of them seem to be working with a sort of a different data input philosophy depending on the output they're looking for, the application they're looking for, whether that's, obviously when we get to the clinic, oftentimes the conversation revolves around bigger data in terms of population, disease state, that kind of thing. But on the discovery side, it seems like there's a lot of kind of there are different data inputs. So I want to kind of get your take on that. Like, and I know it's a highly variable answer, right? Super variable response. But if I'm, let's say, a developer of antibodies in oncology, right? I'm focused on oncology, and I'm to date been sort of doing things the traditional wet lab, academic translational science route, but I want to apply some machine learning tools. Like, where do I start? Like, what in terms of data, where do I start? I mean, I could ask you that question on a couple levels, in terms of data, in terms of application, in terms of technology. But like, how do I even know that if I have an application that will work and process my data? How do I know that I'm using the right data? I know that's a very
it's a tough question to answer, right? Like let's say, for example, let me zoom in on this a little bit, right? Let's say you're trying to develop a new PD-1 antibody, right? The world needs another PD-1 antibody for some reason. Let's say you're trying to develop a PD-1 antibody. Well, so there's actually a ton of data out there, right? You have how many, I don't know, 50 antibodies that are PD-1.
Yeah.
So you know the target. So you similarly, like the way that I try to suggest to scientists to think about it is, take what you're doing now and try to create some process or algorithm out of it. An algorithm is simply a process, right? But try to create an algorithm out of it in your head or on paper, right? Or however you want to do it. And so in the case of, let's say, for example, like a PD-1, well, the first step would be collect all the sequences of PD-1 antibodies. And it's sort of like I'm going to give a sort of a very like elementary example, right?
Yeah.
You could do a multiple sequence alignment of those, right? And potentially build a model that understands like the relationship between each amino acid sequence and all the other amino acid sequences in that multiple sequence alignment. And you could start to potentially generate new antibody sequences. Now, whether they're patentable or not, that's not going to get into the sort of the IP question, but you could like based upon what's been observed of what's interacting. Now, there's some challenges around that because like, the CDRs and the frameworks act very differently. How do you do light chains and heavy chains separately? So you start to run into these different problems. But at a very basic level, this would be a way you could do that. There are lots of different other ways, right? Because the thing is, going back to what I was talking about earlier with the deep learning, right? The computer is creating its own representation of what it means to be a cat. Computers can also create their own representations of what it means to be a sequence, right? We often think about, like especially the structural biologists. If you take an amino acid sequence and you want to represent it in a three-dimensional space, right? You're going to create an XYZ coordinate plane of that three-dimensional structure. And to some extent, part of the reason we as humans do that is because we perceive the world in 3 dimensions, or 4 dimensions if you want to count time. But computers aren't limited by that. They don't have this need to perceive. They don't have this need, right? So you can actually create a, 1,000 dimensional space. I don't know what 1,000 dimensions looks like. Doesn't make any sense to me what a 1,000 dimensional universe. I'm sure there are way more dimensions than 3. I just don't know what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But the computer is not limited by that. And so now you can create this representation that's not interpretable by humans, but is interpretable by a computer. And you can use that representation of now your PD1 sequences to try to find something that matches that representation. So this idea means that you don't need necessarily big data to solve these problems.
Yeah.
You just need to find a way to let the computer represent your sequences. You don't need to do the machine learning of labeling the cat images in your own way. You let the computer determine it through all these sort of statistical algorithms that are happening in the background.
In this is maybe a silly question, but I ask a lot of those. In this multi-dimensional computational environment that you describe, theoretically, it occurs to me that another reason for scientific skepticism might be that in a world like that with that many dimensions, your output is going to be unbuildable. Like how big a problem is that? How big a problem is like generating data that supports perhaps a molecular design and then finding that like that might be doable in computational dimensions, but not in physical dimensions? Is that a thing? Is that a thing?
This is a really, really good question. You ask a great question. No, not a silly question. So this is sort of like that second stage, which aligns very much into the idea of like antibody discovery and antibody engineering, right? Just because I can discover an antibody using phage display or immunization that hits the target doesn't mean that I can make it at scale in a way that is economical, and I can create a drug in a consistent way that allows me to get the FDA to approve my IND. It's a similar type of question, right? And so this is where the whole trying to figure out whether this antibody is developable, right? And analyzing antibodies for developability.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of work happening on this. This is actually where a lot of effort is happening in the research space around developability. Because I can hand a sequence to a molecular biologist, which is, the output of our platform is a sequence, right? We don't sell software. We sell a sequence. We provide a sequence to people.
Yeah.
If you're a molecular biologist, you can turn that sequence into something that can be generated by a cell, as long as it's not, doesn't get, Golgi doesn't get clogged up, right? Because it doesn't work. It doesn't actually come out. Right, these are expression level problems. So yes, it is a big problem to know that just because the AI or the computer suggested it, is it actually makeable in a biological sense? The hypothesis is that because what you're training on has been observed and made, that distinguishing feature, that feature will then carry into whatever you're generating.
Gotcha.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's always true, because I don't know if you've used any of the sort of like stable diffusion type of products to make a picture, and people show up with like 6 fingers or 3 fingers.
I haven't. Yeah.
This actually is a function of the training data, because a lot of it has to do with like cartoon images.
Yeah.
Where like the Simpsons have 4 fingers, right?
Yeah. Now, is computational equipped to solve the problem it creates?
Is computation equipped to solve the problem that?
So, in the event that that at the design stage, the output is something that is seemingly, to the human eye, to the human mind, unbuildable, undevelopable, is there then an opportunity for machine learning to turn around and correct its mistake?
Correct. I'm glad you said those 2 words together, because it is not machine doing, it is machine learning. right? And so it becomes an iterative process where the computer can then be said, you can, let's use expression level as an example, right? You take that sequence that the computer did output, or sets of sequences the computer had generated, you make them and use expression level as a proxy for whether or not it can be made or not.
Yeah.
You can feed that information back into the computer, and the computer can learn from those expression levels so that its next iteration, it will, skew more towards those that had higher, that the features of those sequences that had higher expression levels, and skew away from the ones that had lower expression levels. So the interesting thing about this is that the computer can then you can actually do multi-parameter optimization. So if you think about the sort of the traditional way you would design and, discover and develop an antibody is, you run a campaign, you make your antigen, you run a campaign, either immunization or display, you pan your animal, or it's not panning, but right, you pan your library. You then, right, now you have a set of sequences that have risen to the top. You produce them recombinantly, then you check their expression levels, you check their binding, you check their, right, like their function, you check their developability, and you're doing this in a series of tests. The computer is actually not limited to that. It can actually test all of these things at once, so that it's actually trying to predict what's going to, because if you get to step 49 and it fails,
yeah,
you got to go all the way back. You got to go back some set of steps. So the computer is trying to predict as much as possible. Every time a computer gets more information into itself, it can iterate on those. And so this goes back to your original question of like, where do you start with the data? Well, it depends on what problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or sets of problems you're trying to solve.
It sounds like we're talking about an industry led by human beings who are uncommonly accepting of failure. You have to be in this business. I mean, it's the de facto standard. And it sounds like the fail fast, fail cheap, benefit of computational only accelerates your rate of failure, but in a good way.
Yeah. I mean, like, you think about just sort of scientific publications as a whole. How many people are publishing on failed experiments?
Yeah, none.
I mean, it's probably like something less than 1%, right? Yeah. So you're not passing that learning on to other scientists. You're only passing your wins on to other scientists. And so in this case, the computer actually gets value out of failed experiments and out of successful experiments, as opposed to maybe that small group of scientists in a lab who get the value out of it. And that learning can then generalize. And that's really where you really want to move into the sort of the generalized learning. And going back to the idea of like failing fast and failing, quick, and failing inexpensively. Now you'll obviously lose out on some true positives at the expense of, failures. But I think that in the end, that actually, like if we can get more drugs and get more drugs to the clinic, that's better for the population as a whole.
Yeah. You talk about, there's an interesting point you made around learning, the machine's ability to learn from its failures and to aggregate, failures and learn from that aggregation. What, I'm not sure how to phrase the question, but I'm curious about the play of proprietary and like proprietary IP and proprietary technology and even proprietary data in this sense, like the value in, the value and acceptance of publishing failure, publishing for the world's consumption is somewhat obvious. Like, don't repeat those failures. Learn from others' mistakes en masse, and machines can do that en masse, right? But is that allowed? Like, is that allowed, and to what degree is it allowed? Like, for if I'm a drug developer and I'm using computational, and last month I ran 14,000 iterations and 14,000 of them failed, wouldn't that still just kind of live in a closet somewhere?
Oh, it's absolutely living in a closet.
Yeah.
But just as much as the successes, right? That one success is also hiding in a closet as well.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Right, like that, those 13,999 failures and that one success, they're all being held because of the nature of the industry. Um, like we often get this question, like, doesn't my data help your algorithm, and then doesn't that help my competitors?
Yeah.
Um, and so the I'm a bit of an altruist. Can we, like, if you take the word competitor out and you just put in patient, does
Yeah.
that change your behavior? Does it change your, like, sort of thinking around that? But again, I'm a bit of an altruist.
Right.
And so it does stay hidden. But the really beautiful thing about the time that we're living in today is that the number one growing data set in the world is internet data. The number two growing data set in the world is financial data, and the number three growing data set in the world, fastest growing data set in the world, is biological data, primarily driven by sequencing. And the number of people who are now starting to come into the space from the technology side that can actually do something with that data,
Mm-hmm.
it's not growing at the same speed, and it doesn't need to, but it's I find it to be very promising. And the cost of doing things like other types of data generation is going to go down, where you're going to see it more widely distributed, right? Like mass spec, the cost of mass spec is coming down, right?
Yeah.
How much it costs to sequence 10 years ago versus today. And so that creation of that data is actually going to, I think, means that the data that's hidden is going to become less and less valuable over time.
Mm-hmm. As that trend occurs, I want to get back to a point I made earlier when I was asking a very convoluted question about proprietary data and proprietary systems. In the earliest of conversations, a few years ago with biotech execs who were, in some cases back then founded on computational biology, like it was central to the formation of the company. We're seeing a ton of that now, but in the early days, it was sort of a rarity to have a conversation with someone who's like, yeah, we believe that we can discover and develop molecules using computational tools. Those tools were almost exclusively proprietary. These companies, they adopted technology coming out of an academic lab, or they perhaps hired programmers and developers and spun the technology up themselves. Does that remain the case? What's the forecast for the commercial market of applications that are more, I mean, you say plug and play, but to whatever degree, plug and play, like off the shelf software applications that biopharma companies can plug in, put their data in, and start to play in this realm?
There are quite a few companies doing that,
Mm-hmm.
and businesses doing that. I think one of the things that's interesting, though, is that unlike the biotech space, right, where your patents are really core to what you're doing, the software space is like completely opposite. Everything's open source.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's a little bit of a different mentality. It goes back to the sort of the difference between scientists and engineers, right, and how they think about the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are software platforms that can help you analyze your data, and so those are there. You look at, like, in the antibody realm, there's a company called Pipe Bio that does this. It does a really good job. They're like a bioinformatics for biologics.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that the proprietary algorithms are less and less likely to be of value, because the speed of research is going to outpace the protections that you can keep internally. And once you patent your algorithm, you've basically given it away. It's not like a molecule where you can actually test whether somebody's made it. Like, if you can't see underneath someone's hood, and they can make some minor modifications, and then your patent is kind of useless.
Yeah.
And so there's far less patenting in software space. So what's really important is to actually think about the output. right? That medicine, the AI is a tool. It's not a, right? It's a tool.
Yeah.
It's not, in my view, it's not a property thing, but the molecules that it generates are.
Yeah. Gotcha.
What you
Yeah.
develop, because that has utility. That has real utility.
Right. Yeah. Is
that's what you're asking about. That's what you're asking about.
What's that?
If that's what you were asking about.
Well, yeah, but that last statement you just made resonated, but it sounds controversial. I mean, if you asked these, you said there's a whole cottage industry or several players in the software space who are coming to bear with applications. I mean, I think they'd probably argue that last point you made, wouldn't they? That this is, it's property, right? Like,
yes.
Did I miss something there?
Yeah. So I probably wasn't completely clear on that. So what I meant was,
or I didn't completely understand.
Like if I wanted to write an algorithm on 2 + 3,
mm-hmm.
right? And I patented an algorithm on 2 + 3. Well, somebody else could just go ahead and do an algorithm on 1 + 4 or
right.
2 + 2 + 1. And so what I mean by that is once you patent it, the ability to sort of work around it is actually it's algorithmically, it's like it's fairly trivial. Now,
right.
just because you can design an algorithm doesn't mean, number one, that you can make it work at scale, right? Like there's lots of amazing research coming out of universities of these algorithms that can do these things, but to put them into production, very, very complicated,
mm-hmm.
right? That's one side of it. And the other side is like, can you even make money off of it, right? Like, is there a business out of it?
Yeah.
And so what good companies are doing is they're stringing together technology in very unique and innovative ways. And that's where sort of the value comes into play, right? Like an antibody unto itself is not going to solve your problem. You have to be able to make a formulation out of it. You have to have a cell line that you can standardize out of it. You have to like figure out the patient cohorts it can go after. It doesn't actually have a lot of value unless you're biotech, right? It doesn't have value to the patient until it gets to market. And so just because I have an algorithm doesn't mean that it has value.
Yeah.
And value's met when you hit the market. And so what I meant by the property side of things is like, just because you can patent an algorithm doesn't mean that somebody can't come along and do some new version of it.
Gotcha.
Right?
Okay.
I mean, ChatGPT is a very, very, very good example of this.
Yeah.
The T in ChatGPT stands for transformer. That was a model that was first presented by Google in 2017. Google introduced a transformer. ChatGPT is OpenAI is not owned by Google, right? And so they found another way to leverage that really powerful algorithm to turn it into a business.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that clarification. And I know that we're running a little bit short on time. So you got time for like one more, and then we'll.
Yeah, for sure.
Here's what we're gonna do. I'm gonna ask you one more question on something that I've been wanting to get your take on, and then we're gonna get back together again for another episode where we maybe zero. We'll take a poll of the hottest question area in terms of computational among our audience members, and that's where we'll focus. We'll have a more focused discussion next time. This has been very comprehensive and enlightening. But you mentioned just a minute ago, you talked about the challenge of marrying scientists and engineers. And that's another common refrain among companies who are adopting computational tools in biopharma. Very common refrain. I could cite a half a dozen execs who have said, science is easy, technology is easy. Marrying humans, one group who is brought up in the wet lab and one group who is brought up in the IT lab, and getting them to work together effectively and efficiently in the same building is more challenging than science and technology. What do you think of that?
There's a great quote from Michael Pollan, and he said it goes something like this: that the key difference between understanding the difference between scientists and engineers is how they actually solve problems. Scientists, in general, solve problems by controlling everything and reducing something to its smallest point and then measuring that one thing, right? But engineers are trying to deal with irreducible complexity, right? So like simple example is like duct tape, right? If for an engineer, if the duct tape works, who cares? It works, great, right? For scientists, they're going to want to know like all the different things about the polymer and like the thermodynamics. So what you have as a result of this is groups of people who speak completely different languages and approach problems in very different ways, which is really, really good. It's a really good thing because it provides diversity. The valuable teams have a translator in the middle who speak both. Someone who speaks both biology and technology.
That sounds like a rare breed.
It is a very rare individual. There are probably 1,000 of them on the planet.
Yeah.
But there are going to be more of them in the future. And one way to sort of accelerate that process is take a month, put your technologist in the wet lab for a month, teach your biologist how to code, right? They will then, like, it's like when you go to a new country, I don't need to speak Italian perfectly. I just need to know to ask how to order a beverage and where the bathroom is.
Right.
That will get me over the edge and will make people in the country of which I'm going to more receptive to me. If I'm willing to sort of like push along the edge. Parisians are a great example of that. If I ask Parisians, like, where's the nearest cafe, as opposed to even trying to speak a little bit of French, the difference is night and day. So I think that that's part of the way to sort of overcome this, with just a little bit of training. On both sides on how their problems are. There's a lot of hand waving and like, oh, you're just doing some compute, right? Like, oh, you're just, using a pipette, right? It's not that trivial, right?
Yeah. And I applaud that. That was a big question to ask you in the waning moments of our recording together. I'm sure there's a lot more to go on there, but you know what? We'll do it. We'll have you back. Matter of fact, I'll throw a poll out there right now. Audience, if you want more Andrew Satz, you send me an email and let me know. We'll get more of it.
I don't know that anybody wants to hear any more from me.
No, there's so much more to hear. Like I had so many more questions for you, but I know we both need to get running, and I don't want to hold our audience hostage for too long. So part 2 and beyond, TBD. But I appreciate you hanging with my sometimes they're neophyte questions, but this is an arena where I think a lot of people are coming into it going like asking the same questions I'm asking. Right? Like if we don't have it's not something that you get your mind around too easily until we dig into the details, and you're very valuable for that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I'm happy to share. I think that there's a lot of value that can be leveraged here to really transform our sick care system into a true healthcare system, right? Yeah. We have it's going to be incremental, or it's going to be 0 to 1. Some place we have to start to make some 0 to 1 changes.
Yeah.
And so, how do we do that?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, there's a giant continuum of topics to talk about in terms of application of these technologies in the healthcare space. And I look forward to doing that with you. And I appreciate the intellect that every time we talk, a little bit rubs off on me, and I appreciate that.
Thank you so much. I'm grateful to be here, and I feel the same, right? I absolutely enjoy our interactions. They're fantastic. And I'm honored to be a guest, because I'm very different from the people that I've listened to on your podcast in the past. Yeah,
but I think, but they need to hear this stuff. So thanks, Andrew.
All right. Thanks, Matt.
So that's Andrew Satz. I'm Matt Pillar. This is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online, part of the Life Science Connect community, with support from Cytiva, which demonstrates its commitment to new and emerging biopharma companies at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. If you like listening in on conversations with biopharma leaders like Andrew, subscribe to the Business of Biotech podcast anywhere you listen. Be sure to leave us a review. And as always, thanks for listening.